Hi, so in this video I'll be going over what we describe as choice architecture, and this is where we use cognitive biases, which I discussed in a previous video, or the previous video if you want to check that out, what sorts of cognitive biases that we're exploiting in this video. But we're exploiting cognitive biases in order to influence the choice that an individual will make. So we're sort of being architects in that we're presenting choices in a different way. We don't necessarily change the choices, sometimes we can change the choice, but the way in which a choice is presented is used to affect how an individual actually makes a choice and what they choose. So this can be used by individuals, so you and I, if you could use some of these techniques if you're trying to make someone choose something in particular, but it's also used by businesses and perhaps even more commonly by governments in getting people to choose certain things, or at least to view their options differently and in a way that the government wants them to view their options. So I'll give some examples of the key forms of choice architecture, and hopefully the idea of choice architecture will make a bit more sense once we've gone over the examples. So the first example that we'll give is what we call framing, and this is altering the context or the way in which a choice is framed, and this is thus changing the way a choice is presented in order to influence how somebody makes the choice. And this one's very common. People and governments do this all the time. So for example, you could, if you're, say, signing up to a gym, you may have the option of, say, £350 per year to pay, or you could be given the choice of, say, £30 per month. And maybe £30 per month seems a lot more appealing to you because you only have to pay £30, whereas £350 is a big payment. However, if you're paying £30 per month over the course of 12 months, this is going to work out, obviously, as £360 per the year, so it's actually more expensive, but we may frame the choice in a different way to make it look like a certain option is better to choose from. And governments and individuals will do this all the time with just any sort of statistics that they're presenting if they're trying to get across a point. In this case, the point is our gym memberships are cheap and you should purchase them. But any point we're getting across, we tend to frame them in a way that makes it look better and a way that helps to get across our point. So that's framing, and it's, again, it's changing how a choice appears to make it seem more likely that you would choose it. So the second one here is going to be nudges, and this is where some options are made easier to choose than others, and again, this is very common. So one example of a nudge we may have is that we have smoking is not allowed in certain areas, and so this sort of policy is being used perhaps to get people to quit smoking, and it's harder to choose to smoke because you're no longer allowed to smoke in restaurants or in offices or what have you. There are lots of other nudges, so if we think about, say, in traffic theory, if a government changes the road layout for a certain set of roads, so one route means that it takes longer, they perhaps add bollards to make you have to go around a longer route. Maybe this can ease traffic congestion as you see this route as now being less appealing. Maybe it doesn't even take longer, but they've changed the route in some sort of way that it comes across as more dangerous or whatever, or it is through a less scenic area. Then you may choose to go a different route, and this is the idea between nudge theory, that you don't necessarily alter the choices that people have, but you change how easy it is to choose that choice, and by doing this you nudge people in a certain direction to change their behaviour. The next one is one where we do actually restrict the choice that people have, and this is restricted choice. So we give people a limited number of choices, and in this way we are sort of narrowing down people's options, so they have to make a choice between fewer things, so it's more likely that they choose the thing that we want them to choose. So some examples of this are that households tend to have to put down their address when they want to sign up to, say, a new medical centre, or even when they're signing up to schooling, and that you can only sign up your kids to a certain school or sign up to a health centre that is in your area, it's in a catchment area. And so you are given limited choices, and in this way people may not necessarily notice that, oh, there's a school that is much better for my children that is outside the areas, and you don't necessarily notice that the schools you are choosing from are not great, because the only choices you actually have are all not great schools. And the same can be said for health centres. And so we also see restricted choice, say, in a referendum. If hypothetically you were having a referendum on whether you were going to remain in the European Union, we would see that the options would be yes or no. Whereas in reality, you could have lots of yes options where, yes, we remain in the Union, but we change certain aspects of this Union. So we change, say that we're part of the customs union, or that we're part of the free movement of labour part of the European Union. And the same can be said with no. We don't want to remain in the European Union, so we do want to leave. But do we want to leave with a trade deal? Do we want to have some sort of trade deal set up? Do we want to negotiate with individual countries? Do we want to negotiate with a number of countries? And so there are lots of different options there could be here, but you tend to have a restricted simple yes or no in a referendum, and there are obviously reasons behind why you can't have lots of options in a referendum, but it is an example of where we have restricted choices. A fourth one is where we have mandated choice, so we have to make a choice, and we're forcing every person to make a choice. If we have our referendum example, you don't have to cast a vote, and some people aren't even allowed to cast a vote if they're not over the voting age. But there are other things where people have to make a choice, and an obvious one of these is whether you want to be an organ donor, which we see in lots of countries. And so you have to make a choice on this. You are not just automatically opted out, and if you decide you want to become one, you can, if you want to write a letter to the government or a certain department of the government to sign up to be an organ donor, you have to make a choice, and it's a yes or no choice, but you have to. So this sort of links into the default choice, which is my final example of a piece of choice architecture. And because we have a mandated choice, we do tend to also have a default option in this organ donor example, where you have a default option in a choice. So the default option, say in the UK, is that by default you are not an organ donor. Whereas in, say, Sweden, I believe the default option is that you are an organ donor and you have to opt out of the program. And we see this a lot where we have checkboxes. Say we're signing up to a site and they'll have a checkbox like, so tick this box if you want to receive news and updates by email from this company, or do you want to receive our newsletter or whatever, and you have to check that box. And it often depends what the default choice is that we choose. So people are a lot less likely to uncheck a box that is empty. So if they see a box that's ticked, they'll tend to leave it ticked, and if they see an empty box, they will tend to leave it unchecked. So in countries where we're not automatically enrolled as an organ donor, we tend to see far fewer people become organ donors than countries that are automatically organ donors. If you're automatically one, people don't tend to opt out because it seems heartless, whereas if you're automatically out and you're not automatically an organ donor, people don't tend to see it as such a bad thing that you're not one, because that's the default choice. So that's just an example of one where what we set as our default option for something can massively influence people's actual choices. They don't actually necessarily care too much about whether they are an organ donor or not. They're not too passionate about it because you're going to be dead by the time you're donating your organs. So people just tend to stick with the default option a lot of the time. So our default choice does matter quite a lot. So that's a brief introduction to choice architecture. Please do leave a like if it was at all useful. Make sure to subscribe for lots more economics videos, and check out the playlist for more introduction to economics.